One of the things I'm asked so much by a lot of the younger generation, like the Babybats just getting started, or the ones that have been involved for a while, but now you're at the age where you can hit the clubs. You can go to the goth nights, you can go to the events, you can go to all of these things. And something that you're all very curious about is, what is the dynamic like? Because it's kind of a nerve-wracking experience. You're integrating in real life spaces for the very first time, and you want to know what to expect. And when you've had that long to kind of stew on something, they always say like the waiting is the hardest part. And when you've allowed so much time to pass, or so much time has been forced to pass because of the age to get into these events, your mind kind of goes a little bit haywire with certain things, and it really can take things to an extreme. And sometimes you can kind of imagine the worst when it's really not that bad, and it really isn't. And I know that I often tell people it's going to be so much different than what you've been kind of interfacing with online, because online people are brutal. People are very brutal within the subculture, and you have a lot of people that are integrating in these online spaces that are really not part of the subculture, or they're more the vacationers. Like they're here, they're gung-ho about it, and they go in hard, and then they get bored of it and they move on to the next thing. But when they're here during that moment, that's when they're the most intense and can be very intimidating for a lot of people. So when you're interfacing with that as a young goth or a new goth, you're thinking, I definitely do not want to go to an in real life experience, because if this is what I'm getting online that's making me feel this way, imagine what it's like in person. It's really not. It's so different, and I don't want people to be put off. But there is something that I do want to talk about, and it's something that to me is really funny when I think about it today. And I don't know if it's truly like that right now, but because I'm coming from a different perspective now. When I go to events, I'm going there as an adult. I've been involved for over 20 years, over 25 years. So for me, I'm not a baby bat anymore. But when I first started going to goth nights and actually integrating, now, something that's really important to note is that when I first started getting involved, I was very young. So my first clubs, I was 14, and really venturing into the city and going to goth nights in New York City, I was 15. And it was 18 to enter, 21 to drink then, but I had a fake ID. Now, I'm not advocating you do that, but it's just something that we did. It's like, okay, how do we make it so we don't look so obvious? It's like, well, we can't say 18 because 18 is what they're going to expect us to say. But we can't say 21 because then we'd ring alarm bells, because 21 means old enough to drink. So we'll say that we're 19. So we're old enough to get in, but we're not old enough to drink. So we don't raise any alarm bells. And it seemed to be kind of a magic number because we managed with no qualms. However, we had to renew it and get a brand new one once we hit 21, because some of us, we didn't want to raise those bells. So we're like, oh crap, I'm fake 21 now. I have to go back and make myself 19 again. So it's a big process. But, that long side road to just kind of say, when we were getting involved, we were much younger. And there were people that, like, that was just me. There were people that were even younger than that. I'm talking 12 and 13 going into these goth nights. And when I tell you and I say, we really didn't face any issues going in. We didn't feel like, well, not that we didn't feel like it, because we had our own insecurities, or at least I did. I definitely had my insecurities. I had my moments where I felt like, I wanted so desperately to be accepted, and I felt like all eyes were on me and they were judging me, and they were saying, no, we see you, you're fake. Obviously that wasn't true, but it's the insecurities that we all have. We all kind of think the worst in situations like that, when it's really not as bad as we kind of perceive things to be, or tell ourselves that they are. So when we went into these situations, and we're talking, it's New York City, so you're getting groups of goths and baby bats from all of these different areas. So you have all the boroughs, and you have Long Island as well. But not only that, you have people from New Jersey. So you get all these baby bats together, not just, the boroughs alone, but just Long Island on its own had all of these little pockets of goth groups. And then you had the boroughs. You had the people from Brooklyn. You had the ones from Queens. You had the Bronx. You had Manhattan. You had Staten Island. You had New Jersey. So you had people from everywhere. All these little groups, these little subgroups of baby bats. And if people were concerned about going in and they were like, I'm just really concerned that there's going to be, say, elitism or gatekeeping or people being unfriendly or unkind, you weren't going to get that from the older group or the OGs when you went in. It was always baby bat on baby bat aggro. And you had all of these temperaments going in, and it was people, young kids, trying to prove themselves, and they're looking at everyone else, and they're trying to prove you to be a poser. And I can't imagine, as as an adult, I'm wondering what that must have looked like. It must have looked like Wild Kingdom, because some of the things that I remember and some of the stories and the things that went down, it boggles the mind as to how the hell I didn't notice at least a bevy of elders around us just cracking up at the antics. But we would come in guns a-blazing, like, we are goth, we are this, we're meant to be here. When I say we, I meant the groups that I went with. I was more of a wallflower. I like to kind of keep to myself. I would, talk when situation kind of called for it, but I liked to observe. And I still kind of do that when I go to places or I go to events. I like to just sort of watch and listen. I'm more of a participant now, but back then I was learning. I was young. I was new. I didn't really know much of what was going on around me. So I just wanted to listen. I wanted to absorb. I wanted to see how other people got along, and it was interesting. I had fun. So what you would see a lot is this baby bat on baby bat aggression, and it was so crazy because I've even had altercations with baby bats from other areas, ones that went to, say, were from Long Island and went to different high schools, or I was like these little toddler gangs in black running around yelling at each other, calling each other poser and quizzing each other. So our group really, I feel like our group was the one that was a little bit more neutral when it came to that kind of thing. So our group consisted of two different high schools. You had Sachem High School and Connecticut High School, and those high schools are very close together, only separated by a town. So a lot of people knew each other from both high schools, and I was Sachem, the other group was Connecticut, and we all just hung out together. We would go to club nights together, and especially shows. I later learned that in the city they referred to us as the 516 crew, and I say that kind of reluctantly because it wasn't a good reputation that we had. And we were young. Like I said, we ranged in ages from like 13 to 16 to some 17 or 18, but we were the 516 crew. And they said that we were like grapes. We traveled in herds, whatever that meant. But we all went to things together, and especially shows. And when we would show up to these events, we would show up like 30 of us at once. And the 516 crew was our area code. It was a bunch of kids that felt very cool because suddenly they're part of something that to them is just, it's massive. You're part of a subculture, this new thing that no one knew really existed. And we're all very, very passionate about the music. We're passionate about the music, passionate about the community, and we're very enthusiastic about being involved. And it's to the point where people got, I hate using this term, they got very gatekeepery when it came to a lot of it. And it was to the point where, those quizzes I used to talk about in the past, you get that inquisition sometimes by some of the elders. And like I said, that kind of thing was always few and far between. I've said this in the past. It happened to me like once. And when that kind of thing did happen, it was just the pretentious group, and they were not the majority. The scene in it, like on the whole, was so huge that this group was very tiny. So it very, very rarely happened. But when it did happen more frequently, you were getting that amongst your peers. You were getting it amongst the other baby bats because they were so enthusiastic, and you had these different groups, these different people from different areas that didn't know each other, and they were constantly side-eyeing and saying, no, you are a poser. You're a poser. You're not supposed to be here. No idea why. I don't know if it was their way of maybe pulling rank and kind of feeling more established, more part of the community, that they can kind of police things like that. But it was like the younger they were, the more aggro they were. So some of the things that went down at these goth nights, just to kind of be like a fly on the wall as an adult, just to travel back in time, just to see what that chaos must have looked like. I wonder to this day what the OGs of the scene thought. But once you got out of a certain age range, it did stop. But some of the things I remember seeing, and please don't judge me. Please don't judge me for some of these. So you had, I'm not going to name her name because there's so, like, because I always want to name names because I love being that descriptive. I'm not going to name names. To any of you people, if you've been to the bank in New York City, if you've ever been to the bank, you remember there was that second level, and then you had the spiral staircase to get up on one side, but on the other side, you had the staircase to get down, and it was by the bar. So we had this friend who I will not name because that's mean. And the reason I'm using finger quotes when I say friend is because she was sort of the friend to others. I didn't like her. She was mean. She was obnoxious. She kind of went out of her way to draw attention to herself in a not so positive light and do things that made other people uncomfortable, and even overstepped some serious boundaries. I remember one time waiting at a bus stop, and it was myself, it was my old best friend, and it was her. And we were sat at the bus stop, and like I said, she liked to get attention in ways that made other people very uncomfortable, and sometimes overstepped some serious boundaries with people. So there was a man waiting at the bus stop. He was an older gentleman. He must have been at least in his 60s. He was Hispanic. He didn't speak English because, I know because she kept trying to talk to him. And the bus, as it's about to pull up, she grabs him by the face and like just kisses him right on the lips. And he went beet red. He was so uncomfortable. He didn't know what to do. You could tell that it was like very unwanted. It's a very uncomfortable situation. As you can imagine, it's like we butt heads a lot. So fast forward, we're at a club called The Bank, and she is at the top of the balcony. She's on the top of the balcony, and I'm down by the dance floor, and she spots at the bar this guy that she has a crush on. And she sees him, she spots him, and she's like, starts waving her arms, yelling, shouting over the music, and surprisingly we can hear her to get his attention. He can't hear her. So she goes to the stairs, and mind you, he's at the bar, so he's actually right at the bottom of the stairs. So she's going to saunter, make her way to, it's a tall staircase. If you've ever traversed staircases and in a club with boots on, you know that anxiety. So I'm watching as she goes to the staircase, and she takes one step down. I should not be laughing at this. She takes one step and she just clears it. She tumbles the whole way down and she just lands at his feet. And he looks down at her and he just went, huh, and walked away. And okay, at the very least, we waited to see if she was okay physically, and she was fine. Once I saw that she was okay, I laughed my ass off. I know that's bad, but it was the baby bat drama. You grow out of this. You grow out of it. You get that kind of thing out of your system. Another thing, there was my best friend at the time. He was, he still is. He's gay. And there was someone else from another one of, I guess, the rival Babybat groups. And he was also gay. And for whatever reason, I don't know if this is an unwritten rule, there can only be two goth, pretty gay boys in one club at the same time. There can only be one, or else there will be battle. And every single time they saw each other, it was like one would go with the fan and just kind of wave it in the other one's face. Another one would just give looks, and they would just just shoot daggers at each other from across the room. And it was funny. But one thing I will never forget, we're in the back room of the bank. We're in the back room of the bank. If you've ever heard me talk about the back room of the bank was the place to be, because the back room is where Patrick would spin, and Patrick spun very obscure things that you wouldn't hear in the main room. Main room, you'd hear all of your staples, all the things you did want to hear and you wanted to dance to, you know, your tried and trues. But you went into the back room, especially as a baby bat, that's where we went to learn. That's where all the OGs were, and that's where we could hear. That's where I learned about Corpus Delicti, one of my favorite bands. So you go back there, and it's kind of the cool zone. It's where the cool kids were hanging out. And of course, all the baby bats, that's where they wanted to be. So we have, I don't know, what can we nickname them? Because I don't want to give their names. Well, both their names begin with J. So we're going to say J1 and J2. That's what we'll say, J1 and J2. So a song comes on that they both want to dance to, and they are trying to outdo each other in drama on the dance floor. J1, he's got his fan. J2, he's got his lollipop. So they both got their props. And J2's got his lollipop in his mouth, and he's sucking on it, and he's waving it in the air. J1's got the fan, and then they're doing their turns, their spins, and I don't know what kicked it off, but J2 took his lollipop out of his mouth and just went wham right across the room, and with like deadly precision banged it in the head of J1. And this was a blow pop. It was a brand new blow pop. If you've ever had a blow pop, you know when it's brand new, it's hard. And it was wet with spit, so it just stuck to J1's head, and I ran out of that room because please don't judge me. I laughed my ass off. I was 17. In my defense, I was 17, and it was the most macabre yet glamorous altercation I'd ever seen in my life. And it had a great soundtrack too, but oh, please learn from my example. It was not nice that I laughed, but at the very least I was a teenager, so that is my argument, that is my defense. If this happened, say last Thursday, I would have had a very different reaction, but at 17, and for the most part, it was mostly really little things. You know, people shooting daggers at each other from across the room, and very occasionally it did come to more of, not quite altercation, but confrontation, where one person would accuse another person of not knowing a band or dancing to something that they didn't know, or some stupid, really meaningless, silly crap that really is very juvenile. But if you think about it, it was a bunch of junior high schoolers and high schoolers anyway, kind of coming together in those spaces. So when you think about it, that kind of mentality would be expected. And as we got older, it was something that we grew out of. Now, I myself, I never really liked to get involved in things like that. Like I said, I was a wallflower. That did not mean that I didn't find it really amusing and at times hilarious. I never saw anybody get hurt, and I know that I would feel much differently if I did see anybody get actually hurt. But for the most part, as any teenager would, when you see just some silliness go off, and especially as a new goth, they have to do everything so dramatically. You know, with the clove cigarette, it wasn't even the clove. They had to even take it one step further and get one of those 1920 cigarette holders. So it was like this freaking long. So they would have this freak out, the hand on the head, and then they'd light this 10-foot long clove. So yes, it was hilarious. And I'm glad that I grew out of that. Obviously, we all did. Once you hit a certain milestone, and that could really be anything. It could be your age. It could be the amount of time that you've spent involved in being included in these things. You just kind of calmed down. You kind of let that aggressive spirit go and just started to let your guard down and like let your shoulders relax and just enjoyed things a little bit more. And there were also a lot of things that I thought were really funny with misconceptions. And as I got older and I kind of I started making my way through my teen years closer to like 20, I remember a lot of the misconceptions from the Babybats, and I remember kind of seeing them go through the same steps in the process and the same sort of things that I did. And I would call it out I remember I called it out to my boyfriend at the time, who was older than me, and it was this one thing in particular. So there was this club we went to on Long Island called Detour, and synth pop at the time was very, very big. And synth pop as we know it today versus synth pop back then, they're very different. And I'm going to name a couple of bands for you, and I recommend kind of comparing new synth pop to the old stuff, this stuff. So we have a band called Be Born Baton. There's Division. There's Key the Vez. There's Fictional. Some people may consider Fictional a little bit more EBM, but I'll let you be the judge. So, and then we also had Apoptygma Berserk. That was another situation, but they were not synth pop. So going to these clubs, right, going to Detour, I remember there were these young girls. They were Babybats. They were 15, 16, 17, and I remember a band was going to be coming to play. It was a synth pop band, and I can't remember if it was Key the Vez, might have been Key the Vez, or if it was going to be Born Baton. So something that I learned through my years being a baby bat is that just because a certain band is played within the clubs or within your subculture or is ingratiated into the subculture, for example, things like synth pop, does not necessarily mean that they're part of the goth scene. And it took me a while to figure that out. So one of the main things that made me figure this out, and we'll get back to those Babybats at Detour in a minute. So one of the things that made me kind of have that realization is when I saw the band Apoptygma Berserk on New Year's Eve in, I want to say 1999, 98 to 99. I believe it was 98 to 99 New Year's Eve. And we saw Apoptygma Berserk. And at the time, they had two really popular club hits, one being Love Never Dies, and the other one being Deep Red. And if you've ever heard Deep Red, it's a very dark song. It's about murder. So naturally, hearing that and being involved in the clubs and dancing to those songs and associating that band and those songs with the subculture, you kind of get a mental picture of the band itself. You assume, okay, well, they're part of the scene. So we went to the show, and they come out on stage, and brown corduroy, they look like they should be playing hacky sack. Super normal. And I remember a lot of the crowd being surprised by what they'd seen. But it wasn't just the crowd that was surprised, because this was A-Pop's first show in New York. You could tell by the band, looking at the crowd, looking at us, all goths, that they were not expecting that this was the crowd that they were popular amongst. And that is when I learned that in Europe, different genres of music that may have made it into our club scene are actually mainstream in Europe. I believe, I could be wrong, that A-pop is either Swedish or Norwegian, I want to say. They're European though. And a lot of the bands that we were listening to that were synth pop, and a lot of these, if they were not goth, like straight up goth, and they were European, there were things like synth pop, perhaps maybe more EBM, then you are actually going to be faced with somebody that is playing chart music in their home country and is quite normal in appearance. So back to those girls, Babybats, at the show at Detour. So it was either Key the Vez or it was either Be Born Baton that were playing. And I remember on our way to the show, I told my boyfriend at the time, and I said, you know, those young girls, I said their names, and he said, yeah, because, you know, we'd see them all the time. We talked to them, and they were really nice. And I said, watch, they are going to be gothed out. Like, they're going to take it up to a 10. And he's like, why? I said, the reason why is because they're going to think that the band that's playing is basically going to match their aesthetic. So what they're doing is they're trying to kind of amp it up to match them, because not only are they a band, but they're a band to which they associate with subculture. And he was like, no, what are you talking about? We show up, there they are. PVC, corsets, hair teased up huge, black lipstick. It was an interesting lesson to learn when I did learn it at the time, because it taught me about different genres of music and what they mean in different places. So whereas something here can be ingratiated within the subculture and really mesh well on the dance floor and on our playlists in our daily lives, back in their native homeland, they're on MTV, they're topping charts, they're played on the radio. And the funny thing is, So you remember when I said A-pop Take Me Berserk, when they played, they were the most normal of normal and corduroy and all that? They played the very next year. And when they came, it was like 180. The way they looked, I mean, full face of makeup. The singer dyed his hair black. They were wearing mesh and PVC, and they were wearing dog collars. If you took a before and after and put them side by side, they would not even look like the same people. And it was utterly hilarious. It was like, okay, we know our audience now in the States, so we're going to kind of dress for our audience. And it's weird too, because A-pop went through so many transformations. It's like with every album. And Evil's Toy did the same thing. They started out very dark, and then as each album progressed, they got lighter and lighter and lighter. And I remember one Evil's Toy album, because I think I listened to a lot of old school industrial back in the day, if you don't know that about me, and I still like a lot of the older industrial music. I don't like the new stuff. I like the old stuff. But I digress. So I believe it was Human Refuse was the first Evil's Toy. And if you compare that to what Evil's Toy sounds like now, and they're not even called Evil's Toy anymore. They're called Toy. And I remember in an interview somewhere, they had asked them, why are you known as Toy now? You were Evil's Toy. Why now? Why Toy? And they said, well, we're no longer evil, which is a perfect testament to the weird progression of this music. And again, a progression of music of people who really aren't involved in like your subculture. They're just making music that is kind of applicable, but entirely different in their own country. And they kind of adapt a little bit when they come and play locally, like when they play here. So that was always interesting for me to learn. So nowadays, as an adult, knowing what I do now, and I'm going back to the whole Babybat aggro situation, it makes me wonder. I feel like people have calmed down quite a lot, because in the 90s, when we first discovered this thing, we felt like we discovered something sacred. Because you had to go through so many different channels to find anything. The internet was scarce. It had like barely anything. It took you an hour to just, when you were on a web page, just for all the clip art and the flash images to just download. So you were stuck there forever just for a stupid GeoCities page. So as you can imagine, we didn't have a lot of information out there on the internet. So when there was information that we really wanted out there, things that we wanted to know, we had to look in real life spaces. We had to go through magazines. You go to the back of the magazines. You had to go to like Village Voice, that kind of thing. You had to go to your local alternative or goth store and look for club passes, club flyers, just to really find anything. And when you managed to find something, be it a band or an event, that was sacred, because you really had to go through a lot of channels, a lot of searching, a lot of different sort of things just to discover it. So here you are kind of, in possession of this one thing that it took you ages to find, versus now where I can just kind of, a few clicks on the internet, do a little bit of a search, and I have it in 12 seconds versus the 3 months that it might have taken me back in 1995. So I feel like, even though I'm not a Babybat now, I feel like it might be a lot more relaxed in that regard, because it's not such a heavily guarded secret anymore. Because when people went through such hardcore efforts to find something, they protected it. And as we got older, obviously that kind of thing changed, because, the mentality back then was you'd find this, new band, you'd hear it, and you'd ask a fellow Babybat, wow, what is that? And they'd say, well, I don't reveal my sources. Whereas if you asked an OG, they'd happily give it to you. But nowadays, I feel like it's a lot different because it's more accessible now, and I feel like people communicate a lot differently with one another, and I would hope it's not the same among Babybats. So here's to hoping that in the goth clubs that Babybats are a lot more calm and peaceful and much less chaotic than we were back in the day. But at the very least, I hope that we gave the elders and the OGs a bit of a laugh and were amusing to them, because I would feel horrible if our antics annoyed them in any way. Can I just point out once again that I was more the wallflower? I stayed back in most of these things. And it only lasted a couple of years, to be honest. I think it stopped when... I was about 17 or 18 years old. Because that was when I was feeling a little bit more comfortable, a little bit more at ease. And once that happened, I was fine. God, I'm glad that part's over with.